Hi, this is Professor Don D'Angelo, and I'm presenting a podcast for you today on writing for success. This is an essay and research skills podcast to help you guys dispel a little bit of the anxiety that comes from academic writing, whether it's for timed essays or research papers. It's the culmination of my own writing experience and my own education. It involves some elements that I picked up from a high school English teacher of mine, Dr. Barbara McGarvey, by some colleagues that I've worked with, or English teachers like Kate Zimmer and Marilyn Harmoning. And I've put together this basically a formula that hopefully eases some of the anxiety that we have when we approach writing in a college environment, but also to help us become better writers, period. And hopefully it'll be helpful for you. So writing skills present a dilemma for just about everybody, right? Most people don't like to write. It's the reason why email and Twitter and Facebook and all these other things is so popular, because it doesn't require you to have a lot of writing. It's very truncated and short, and people feel a little more comfortable with it, right? So most people avoid it, so every time they have to write, then it's more anxiety involved. And it becomes really a snowballing effect. We don't write very often, so then every time we write, it becomes an anxious experience, which means that we don't write any more, and then we don't get that experience, and so the next time we write, we have even a more anxious experience. So it just goes on and on and on, and it becomes very difficult to break that spiral. So most people get too wound up on the process and the structure, and they don't have enough energy or even capacity to remember the data and information that they need in order to answer the question, right? They're so hung up on how to just even get started to write that they can't even remember what it is they're writing about. So unfortunately, most people need to write well in many of the professions that we go into, and many of the professional situations, even if we're not in a writing type of career, requires a certain degree of written communication in order to be understood. Whether it's writing memos to bosses and colleagues, or putting together proposals for production projects or whatever, written communication becomes really important. And so the skill is an important one to get as comfortable with as possible, if not downright master it. So most people do not read very often, and a lot of people don't read for fun. And so they never actually witness good writing. And this becomes a problem, because then what's your model for being a good writer? So most people will never be great writers. And so they figure, why even bother trying? It's one of those things where if I'm not going to be an Olympic downhill skiing champion, well, then why even take a lesson? But that's rather limited in perspective. And it's contrary to the whole concept of learning, which is what we call the university system. And again, as I stated just a moment ago, all of us have to write at some point. So it's a good skill for us to really try to be comfortable with. So then how do we fix the problem? Well, learn a basic formula like the one I'm going to show you, and let it help you guide through that process. When you get familiar with structure, then that eases the anxiety. Now that once you feel comfortable with how to put together the essay, well, then you can spend your brain energy on collecting the data and the information that you want to share in order to write your essay. So by practicing these things as often as possible, again, you lessen that anxiety. The process becomes more familiar, and therefore you become more easy with how you approach it. The anxiety comes down, the information starts to flow more freely. So in a lot of my classes, I try to give a practice writing right before the exam writing, just so that you have an opportunity to go through things and get comfortable with the structure and get a little feedback from me about what you might want to worry about. And then bang, you can just go in and get a better result in your timed work. So The other thing that's nice about the formula that I'm going to give you is that it's easily expanded to include research paper assignments, which is something that most of us have to do in the university environment. So by getting the formula down and then just learning how to expand it, you can use it to function in a lot of different courses that you take and disciplines that you are involved in. So in order to fix the problem, you have to realize that not everyone is a born writer, but everyone can accomplish good writing. And that's really what this is all about, right? Whether it's this class that you're taking with me or another one that you're taking with a different professor or a completely different major, you can still figure out a way to do well. And to do that, to realize this, you have to not regret mistakes and missed opportunities. These are chances for you to learn how to be a better writer. And so don't get hung up on them. Don't get, to a point where you're beating yourself up for every mistake that you make or everything that you forget to do. See it as an opportunity to become better at what you do and to have less anxiety about doing it. So what is this basic formula? What's nice about it is everything's in threes. So as many of you already know, essays usually come in three parts, right? The introduction, the body, and the conclusion. This is true of research papers. This is true of scientific papers. This is true about pretty much everything. So what I've done then is, for each of those sections, I did it in threes. So each there's three parts, and each part has three sections. So, and then once you know that formula, you can expand it from timed writing into long-term written assignments and or research papers. So let's get started. So the introductory paragraph is a very important thing that a lot of people just essentially ignore. As you can see, I have a graphic up here with an inverted pyramid or triangle that has three sections to it. So the first part of an introductory paragraph is a broad historical statement. Now, because this is a history class, that would be appropriate. But if you're writing in other courses, you would simply replace historical with thematic. So it's a general explanation of the time period or theme of the essay. It doesn't have to address the question really at all. So the plan of action comes second. This is going to inform the reader or your audience about what are the main points that you are going to present that supports your argument. We're going to call each one of those points a claim that you're going to make. And they should be written one sentence each, and they should be presented in the order that they're going to appear in the body of your essay or research paper. Now, the final thing that you do is to write a thesis statement. What is the main argument you are trying to make? This should be really short. A lot of people write thesis statements that end up being these very long, drawn-out thing that include all this information that you're going to talk about in the essay, and none of it's necessary. So if you look at how I have written it here, the inverted pyramid is for a reason. We start with something very broad and wide. The plan of action narrows down the conversation. And then finally we end up with a thesis statement that is very narrow and specific that tells us exactly what should be the conclusion of this work. So in my example from the text, we go to the introduction to a chapter on Andrew Jackson. So Jackson's election marked the impact of 30 years of democratic innovations in politics. Again, not addressing anything specific about Jackson, but just that this 30 years of democratic innovation takes place. During the 1820s and 30s, as America grew in population and people continued to move westward in ever larger numbers, most white men, whether they owned property or not, were allowed to vote and hold office. The principle of universal suffrage, announced U.S. Magazine and Democratic Review, meant that white males of age constituted the political nation. Such a democratization of voting rights was unique in the world, for it gave previously excluded white men equal status as citizens regardless of wealth or background. No longer was politics the arena for only the most prominent and wealthiest Americans. So as we can see here, the writers of our textbook is basically telling us what we're going to see in the chapter on Andrew Jackson. It's going to start with a broad statement that just says Jackson impacted 30 years of innovation in politics. But then it goes in and tells us, well, the first part's going to be about what's going on in the 1820s and 30s that saw America grow in population and saw migration of people farther west. And that this migration led to changes in voter registration that expanded the number of individuals who could participate in the political process. And so what's the end result of this? Well, according to the authors, the political arena was no longer just for people who were wealthy or had specific backgrounds. It was for everyone that wanted to be a part of American politics, as long as they were adult white men of 21 years of age. So now let's get into the body of the essay. So if you want to think about it, you're going to have, in a timed essay, you're going to have a certain number of points that you want to make. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, you have 3 main points that you're going to present to support your argument. So each one of those is going to be a claim, which means that you need 3 body paragraphs to fulfill your plan of action. So for each of those paragraphs, then, you have 3 parts. We're going to call it claim, data, warrant. So the claim is a major point that you wish to make that supports your argument or thesis. Now, this statement that you're putting forward has to be supported somehow. Well, this is done with facts, and we're going to call that data. So data are facts that you can cite as proof that your claim is correct. And you need at least 2 pieces of data in a timed essay to support a claim. 3 is stronger. Now, in a longer piece, like a research paper where you have ample time to do investigation and research, 4's more the norm, right? So I always tell students, 1 is never enough, 2 confirms the point, 3 makes a stronger one, and 4 nails it to the floor. So just kind of keep that in mind, right? So then that data has to have some explanation written to it. And we call these warrant statements, right? So this is an additional statement to explain how a piece of data supports your claim. So if these 3 elements are in your paragraph, you're in good shape, and you can move forward with that. Now remember, in a long-term assignment, this formula can be expanded by section. So instead of having a paragraph for each claim, you would have a section of your paper for every claim. It might be necessary, for instance, to have an entire paragraph just to explain one piece of data, right? So you'll have a couple sentences laying out the data, but then you have a few warrant statements that explain how that data supports your claim. So if we look at a body paragraph from one of the chapters in our textbook, this is rather a long one, right? Communities founded by the Shakers, officially the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing, proved to be long-lasting. That's the claim, right? How? Well, Mother Ann, right, known as Ann Lee, arrived in New York from England with 8 followers in 1774, believing religious fervor to be a sign of inspiration from the Holy Ghost. Mother Ann and her followers had strange fits in which they saw visions and issued prophecies. These manifestations later evolved into ritual dances, hence the name Shakers. Shaker doctrine held God to be dual personality. In Christ, the masculine side was revealed. In Mother Ann, the feminine element. That Mother Ann preached celibacy to prepare Shakers for the perfection that was promised in heaven helps explain why their membership declined over time, right? I mean, if you can't have sex, there are not going to be many future followers, right? But Mother Ann died in 1784. Again, fact, right? But the group found new leaders, and the movement spread from New York into New England, Ohio, and Kentucky. So again, facts, placing specific places, right, that we can look to for evidence. And then by 1830, about 20 groups were flourishing. So again, right, he's presenting us with facts, right? In these Shaker communities, all property was held in common. Shaker farms were among the nation's leading sources of garden seeds and medicinal herbs, and many of their products, especially furniture, were prized for their simple beauty. So then once we get to the end of our essay, we get a concluding paragraph. In a research paper, it would be a concluding section. And as you can see here, I've reverted the triangle again. Now it looks like a regular pyramid. And that's because we're going to start specific and get more general or more broad. So the first section is thesis proved, right? We want to restate the thesis, preferably in different words, and demonstrate to the reader that, see, you've gone all through this reading and now you and I agree on this one statement. Section 2 is an opportunity to offer opinion. And this is to underscore additional information, right? Or in some instances, kind of like to sing and dance and do a commercial for yourself, because you're going to demonstrate additional learning or knowledge. So is there related data that can add insight? So if I'm talking about Andrew Jackson, if I'm trying to prove that Andrew Jackson actually expanded democracy in America, I might want to put in there that in the spirit of true democracy, after Jackson left the White House in 1837, he returned to his plantation, the Hermitage in Tennessee, and lived the rest of his life in quiet solitude and outside of public view. It doesn't really have anything to do with the question exactly, but it shows that you know what happened to Jackson once he left office, and that gives some additional insight, and it's kind of like an opportunity for you to show off, right? But there may be a need for you to explain contrary data. So again, I've tried to prove that Andrew Jackson was responsible for a major expansion of democracy in American politics, but I never mentioned Native Americans. And that's, that makes Jackson look pretty bad, right? Let's face it. So I'm writing, and along the way I start there, and I start having this itching little problem in my brain that says, this professor is probably going to be thinking, why isn't he talking about Indians? Because Jackson was a bastard to Indians. So that's not very democratic. Okay. Well, part 2 of the concluding paragraph is an opportunity for me to address that and still come out looking like I know what I'm talking about. So let's say, for instance, I decide to just write in there, while it's important to understand that Jackson was nothing but a tyrant when it came to the treatment of Native Americans, one must understand that in this 19th century context, Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States and were outside of the American political system. It is therefore necessary in this argument to separate Jackson's views on Indians with how he perceived the average white man and their voting opportunities. Again, it's showing that you know this exists. It's demonstrating that you're well aware of Jackson's reputation and his well-earned reputation when it comes to Indians, that as far as your understanding was, this question was about American political systems, and Indians at the time were outside of that political system, and you therefore have decided not to address it. That is a way for you to explain contrary data and look like you are an incredibly smart person, or at least a very reasonable person, particularly when it's in a timed writing situation. And then finally, we project forward. What does this issue mean in the future? How does it play in the future? If I'm doing a thematic piece, I want to know how this particular topic plugs into bigger pictures. And this, again, is letting people know that this conversation that you've had has broader applications and implications. And this is very important for us to do in a concluding paragraph. Okay, now, when it comes to concluding paragraphs, we want to remember some things. Most importantly, conclusions might be optional. So first, in a timed essay situation, I might run out of time. It's always very important to remember that your maximum points are going to come from your body paragraphs, because that's the meat and potatoes of your answer. It's where your data is stored. It's where your arguments are laid out. And so that's the most important. If you ever get to a situation where you either have to deal with your body paragraphs or try to rush and get a concluding paragraph in there, drop the concluding paragraph, right? Put your focus where more of the points are going to be scored. In addition, you may have a professor who in a timed writing situation doesn't even care, right, that you have a concluding paragraph. Find out. And if he doesn't, don't worry about it, right? So some professors may just ask you to just not bother. But in a formal research paper or position paper that's a long-term writing assignment, a concluding paragraph is always necessary. And I would argue is essential to demonstrating a broader knowledge of your topic. So here again we have an example, right? This one was on slavery. And so with each passing year, the leaders of the Old South equated the survival of their distinctive region with the preservation of slavery. As the governor of Mississippi insisted in 1850, slavery is entwined with our political system and cannot be separated from it. The increasingly militant efforts of Northerners to restrict or abolish slavery helped reinforce Southern unity while provoking an emotional defensiveness that would result in secession and war and the unexpected end of slavery and the Cotton Kingdom it enabled. So what has happened here? He sits there and talks about, right, with each passing year, the leaders of the Old South equated survival, right? In other words, this is a Southern intransigence on an unacceptable institution. This is the thesis of the entire chapter if you read it, right? But then he adds something. He goes, look, here's a governor of a state in 1850 saying that you can't separate slavery from the political system. Well, that's pretty severe, right? And it adds an additional piece of information. But then that concluding piece there, the very end, right, is projecting forward. Why? Well, the chapter was about the slavery as an institution. So, 1619 up through the 1850s. Well, he's telling you that intransigence, that what he calls emotional defensiveness, leads to civil war, and losing that war meant that they lost slavery, which was an unexpected conclusion to their whole rationalization and justification that they used to hold on to that peculiar institution, which is really the stain of all of American history. So for better writing, for research papers, simply expand the claim data and warrant into multiple paragraphs, right? So again, every claim would be a section and not a paragraph. So something that I learned when I was in college, I just sort of came upon it myself. But now I even do it now when I do pieces for publication. I read the research paper to myself out loud. If you have to stop, it means there's something awkward or wrong with the writing. Just remember, you wrote it. If you have to stop, well, then the professor is going to stop. And the difference is that when a professor stops reading something, it's because something doesn't make sense. And the tendency is to pick up a pen because you're going to want to correct what's wrong. So think of the psychology of a reader and understand that there's certain flow that goes with their reading experience. Anything that disrupts that is going to make them look for errors. And you don't want that to happen, right? The smoother the reading experience for the professor, the higher the grade is for you. So when you're in a timed essay, try to make notes. I'm amazed at how many times people just give me an essay and I look for little notes jotted down to try to clarify what they were doing, and there's nothing there. Even if it's just a list of applicable data or vocabulary words that you think are relevant to the topic, any of that's going to help, right? So you need to prove your support for your thesis. And if you're not using the vocabulary that I've been using or the textbook uses, well, then you're really not demonstrating that you really fully understand the topic or issue at hand. And then you could also use the formula that I showed you as a skeleton to organize your thoughts. So for instance, you could use a little inverted pyramid and break it into 3 parts and jot down what you think would be a thesis statement, a broad historical statement, etc. And then, claim data warrant, just go CDW and see if you can just do bullets to get yourself organized. A lot of times that can make a very big difference in kind of like puffing up your own confidence in doing the work. And then finally, once you have a plan, stick to it. Don't change. It's amazing how sometimes I'll see an entire piece of paper just X'd out and they start over again, and I'm sitting there all frustrated because I'm like, well, you had something good there that you were working with, but something happened to make you change your mind. And it's usually a lack of confidence in what you're doing. But if you take the time to plan out what you're going to do, especially that introductory paragraph, that will subconsciously give you the confidence that you need to move forward and stick to it. So with this information, I hope that some of you will get a chance to try it out, see what you think, and by all means, let me know if it's helpful. I've had great success with it myself, and I have had numerous students. In fact, I was at a 30-year reunion for former students who were coming up to me and telling me, that writing style, I still use it when I'm at work. Sometimes I'll sit there and go, oh yeah, just do it the Angelo way. So hopefully this will be helpful for you. Please, by all means, let me know if it is, and good luck with your writing experiences.